So you may or may not remember, but in Module 4, back when we established what supply and demand was and market equilibriums, one of the assumptions that we had running during that module was that we were in perfect competition. And if you remember, a perfectly competitive market was one where the goods are exactly the same and buyers and sellers were price takers, meaning no individual buyer or seller had any effect on the equilibrium price. And we kind of left it at that. So now we want to revisit market structure. By market structure, I mean perfect competition is an example of a market structure. There's other market structures besides perfect competition. But in this module, what we want to know is how does the market structure affect the firm's production decisions? And so that's the motivating question that we'd like to answer in this module. And in this video, we're going to start by looking at perfect competition. So let's start by reiterating the characteristics of a perfectly competitive market. One, there's going to be many buyers and sellers. And how many is many? Well, it's going to be enough that buyers and sellers are price takers. The second characteristic is what we call homogeneous goods, or in other words, all goods being sold are exactly the same. And three is what we call free entry and exit, which just means that firms are free to enter and exit the market as they wish, and there aren't any large barriers to entry. A barrier to entry would be something that is prohibitively expensive for a typical person to enter this market. So, for example, Uber is pretty much a free entry and exit market. As long as you have a car, you can just sign up for the app and enter that market, and it's relatively low cost to become an Uber driver or quit being an Uber driver. Something that would not be free entry, let's say pharmaceutical research and development. There's a huge overhead to getting into that market. So let's look at the definitions of revenue for the perfectly competitive firm. So we have total revenue, which is just going to be price times quantity. That's the familiar formula for total revenue. We have average revenue. Average revenue is just going to be total revenue divided by quantity. And in the perfect competition case, this is actually going to be equal to price as well. And we'll look at why that is in a little bit. Then we have marginal revenue, which, if you recall, is going to be the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity, or the change in total revenue from selling one more unit. Another equality that holds in perfect competition is the marginal revenue is also going to be equal to price. I could also put that right here. So let's think about why this holds. Well, in a perfectly competitive market, firms are price takers, which means the firm has no effect on price. No matter how much or how little they produce, it doesn't affect the market price because there are so many firms in this market. And so what that means is as they produce more, they don't change the price. And so the marginal revenue, which is the change in total revenue from selling one more unit, well, think about what you get when you sell one more unit. You get the price for that good. So in this case, it's always going to be true that marginal revenue equals the price. And let's be clear, this is only going to be true for perfectly competitive markets. So now let's think about profit maximization in a perfectly competitive market. So when we talk about profit maximization or a firm maximizing its profit, we want to find the quantity that maximizes the firm's profit. And to be abundantly clear here, Q is going to be the amount that the firm produces. And remember one of our rules of economics, which is that people think on the margin or make decisions on the margin. So if we want to know which quantity maximizes profit, think about what happens at the margin as you add one more unit to production. So when we increase the quantity produced by 1 unit, two things are going to happen. Revenue is going to increase by the marginal revenue, and cost is going to increase by marginal cost. And we can look at this under two cases. If marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, then adding that unit of production raises profit because we increased costs, but we increased revenue more. On the other hand, if marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, then increasing that extra unit of production reduces profit because now you've increased cost, but marginal revenues weren't high enough to offset cost. So if marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, you have an incentive to keep increasing more. If marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, you have an incentive to produce less. So you can kind of guess what the profit maximizing outcome is going to be. So when marginal revenue equals marginal cost, the resulting quantity is the profit maximizing quantity. So let's look at a graphical representation of this. So remember, in a perfectly competitive market, the marginal revenue curve or the demand curve is horizontal. So I'll go ahead and write this just to make it clear. In the perfectly competitive market, I think we've set all these things individually, but haven't put them all on the same chart. Marginal revenue equals average revenue, which equals demand. So this one horizontal line is all those things. And then marginal cost is increasing with quantity. So this level of quantity, let's call it Q1. At this point, marginal cost is below marginal revenue. And so you have an incentive to move this way. On this side, marginal cost is above marginal revenue. So you have an incentive to produce less, go this way. And if you're producing where they are equal, you have no incentive to move in either direction. If you move to the left, you could get higher profits by moving back to the right. And if you move to the right, you're losing money on each additional unit produced. So you have an incentive to move back to the left. So let's say the market price changes. Let's say price moves up to some other value, P prime. Well, this is going to change the firm's supply decision because now we've changed where the equilibrium quantity is. So the same rule applies. You still want to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which means this value is the new profit maximizing quantity. And so this is where our rule that supply slopes upward comes from, right? As price increases, it changes the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that's what motivates firms to produce more. Another point I want to make is the price is what we call an exogenous. Firm has no control over the price. If the price changes, it's due to some fluctuation in the market, either on the demand side, maybe consumers are just demanding more of whatever this market is, but they can't affect the price. And so the firm's production decisions are completely determined by their marginal cost. At least that's the one thing they have control over, or what's unique to the firm. And so the marginal cost curve is equivalent to the supply curve in this case, right? Think about what the supply curve is. It's the curve that tells you how much the firm is going to produce at any given price. And that's exactly what the marginal cost curve here is. At any price, we just trace a line from the price over to the marginal cost and down, and that's will tell us our production decision. So now we want to talk about what happens when the firm is not doing well. Your firm is not doing well and it's not profitable. You have two decisions. You can either shut down or exit. So let's define those things. If a firm shuts down, they're going to make a short run decision to not produce anything because of the market conditions. On the other hand, if a firm exits, that's going to be a long run decision to leave the market entirely. The key difference here is that if the firm shuts down, they still have to pay fixed cost. When all the restaurants in Athens closed due to the coronavirus, most of them were still having to pay rent, even though their business wasn't operating. Contrast that with an exit. If you completely exit the market, costs are zero. Assuming you're out of your lease, or let's say it's been a year since you exited the market, there's no cost to pay So let's look at what would motivate a firm to shut down versus exit. So the cost of shutting down is going to be the lost revenue while you're not operating, which is going to be the total revenue during the time that you're shut down. The benefit of shutting down is going to be the cost savings from not operating, which is going to be the variable cost of production since you're still paying fixed cost. So the firm will shut down if the benefit of shutting down exceeds the cost of shutting down. So in this case, if total revenue is less than variable cost, then it's going to make sense to shut down. So we can take this inequality and do some algebra on it. So if we divide both sides by Q, we get two familiar expressions. Total revenue divided by quantity is average revenue, and variable cost divided by quantity is average variable cost. And since we're in perfect competition, average revenue equals price. So price less than average variable cost. So if price is less than average variable cost, that's also going to imply a shutdown. So if you recall, the marginal cost curve intersects the average variable cost at the minimum of the average variable cost. Now, if price is above average variable cost, say price is up here, then this firm is going to produce this amount here. If price is below average variable cost, according to our rule, the firm isn't going to produce at all, right? Price is less than average variable cost, the firm shuts down. And so the firm doesn't really act on this portion of the marginal cost curve. And so if price is anywhere in this region, the firm shuts down. And then everything above average variable cost, they're going to produce according to their marginal cost. And so we actually call this portion of the marginal cost curve the section that's above the average variable cost, the short run supply curve. Because in the short run, they're only going to be making supply decisions based off their supply curve, which is marginal cost, if the price is above average variable cost. If it's below, then they just don't produce. And so we can kind of ignore a portion of the marginal cost curve in the short run. So this is a good time to bring up a definition, which is what's called a sunk cost. And a sunk cost is just a cost that has already been committed and can't be recovered. And so the reason I bring this up is that our decision rule for when to shut down was if price is less than average variable cost, and it's specifically variable cost and not fixed cost, because fixed costs are already committed. So our example of fixed cost, so our running example of fixed cost is rent. Rent is already committed. You have to pay it. And so it's not relevant in the decision to shut down or not. If you shut down, you're still paying rent one way or another. So let's write that down. So in general, sunk costs should be irrelevant to decisions, and fixed costs are sunk costs. And that means that fixed cost doesn't matter in the decision to shut down. So now let's look at what motivates a firm's decision to exit. So again, we have a cost of exiting the market. This is going to be the same as in the shutdown case. It's going to be the revenue lost, which is the total revenue. There's again going to be a benefit of exiting, which is going to be the cost savings. But in this case, we include total cost in this decision because it's a long run decision. And so fixed costs become variable cost. So the cost savings are going to be the total cost. And so again, if the benefit of exiting is greater than the cost, the firm exits. And so in this case, if total revenue is less than the total cost, then the firm exits. Again, we can divide both sides by Q to give us a different representation. And this is going to be price less than average total cost. And if that's true, that also implies that the firm exits. And remember, this is a long run decision. An exit means they are getting out of the market. They're not participating. They're not producing. They're not selling. And so this same decision rule can also be used to define when a firm enters the market, as in they're not currently involved in that market at all and they decide they want to enter. And so just flip the inequality. If price is greater than average total cost, then the firm enters the market. So we can look at this decision graphically as well. The same kind of thing applies. If the price is in this region here, which is going to be below long run average total cost, this is a price region where the firm is going to exit or not participate in the market. And then in this region up here, they're going to produce or sell according to their marginal cost. So just like before, the marginal cost curve above the long run average total cost is going to be what we call the competitive firm supply curve, or just the supply curve. You can also say the long run supply curve, but typically we just say supply curve.